Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre, bringing you conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
A colleague of mine who has done research, Mekla Krishnamurthy, often says that farmers are those who buy everything at retail price but have to sell it at wholesale price. So in some sense, cost is also a very important concern. But the quantity they sell and of the quality that the consumer desires, all of these together make up the incomes. And there I would just want to say that the role of the market goes beyond just establishing price.
The recent proposal by the current government to reform agricultural markets through three controversial farm laws, the farmer protests that ensued, and the ultimate repeal of these laws have raised questions on what a desired policy on agricultural markets should be. Providing farmers access to agricultural markets in a mode that benefits both farmer and consumer has proven elusive. At one end is the mode adopted by the farm laws, a privatisation of agricultural markets by offering space and incentives for private corporate investment, creating a fear that this will lead to a takeover by profit-grabbing corporates who exploit both farmers and consumers. The demand of the farmer protests for strong state intervention guaranteeing minimum support prices and purchase commitments has been criticised as creating market inefficiencies, that it overlooks structural problems and the presence of inconsistencies in the current mandi system, and that it will also create problems for India in abiding to commitments made to WTO rules. A middle ground of reform based on a structure of cooperatives, as was done for the dairy industry, has received insufficient attention. The debate also overlooks the fact that most agricultural holdings in India are termed as marginal, below 5 acres in size, leading to both inefficiencies and exploitation in agricultural markets under current conditions. In this episode of BIC Talks, which is an extract from a virtual BIC stream session that took place in early September 2022, Sudha Narayanan, Research Fellow, International Food Policy Research Institute, New Delhi, T. Nandakumar, former Secretary, Food and Agriculture, Government of India, and Prakash Kamardi, former Chairman, Karnataka Agricultural Prices Commission, engaged in a discussion moderated by editor of the India Forum and founder trustee of Vichar Trust, C. Ram Manohar Reddy, in which they will seek to identify and reflect on the vision and structure of a sensible policy on agricultural markets in India.
Thank you, Lekha. Lekha has set out the framework for our discussion. I'd like to welcome Sudha Narayanan, who's a fellow IFPRI in Delhi, Dr. Prakash Kamardi, who's a former chairman of the Karnataka Agriculture Cost Prices, and Mr. T. Nandakumar, who's a very experienced official who has dealt with agriculture and food at the central government. Let's start with one round of brief talks by each of the speakers, followed by another round, and then I hope we'll have plenty of time for discussion. The topic is vast. There are many issues to discuss. Dr. Kamardi, you've spoken about, different aspects. What farmers actually would be looking for is not so much prices, but predictability. That's one of the things that you've been talking about. So maybe you could speak about that aspect.
Let me start with the COVID. Because during which time so-called controversial farm laws have been introduced. Let me also start from Karnataka. And it started from Karnataka. I think little earlier to the introduction of the three farm laws, Karnataka government took, in anticipation of the national three laws, amendment to its relatively progressive APMC, because we are the first one to introduce separate price commission, so on and so forth. Okay. So I happened to watch very closely the ongoing agitation started from Karnataka. I could listen, I could work as some sort of, a technical advisor to what is APMC, what is MSP, so on and so forth. The something which terribly, disappointed, it had most of us here, during the COVID time, our 10% more area was brought under agriculture during the COVID time. Unlike all other sectors, which virtually crippled. I think we have the comfortable production of, just imagine, during very crucial time, had we experienced the scarcity, prices skyrocketing. That didn't happen. That was really unwanted. The very question, the farm laws have been introduced. So it is ongoing, the farmer struggle, the agrarian crisis, the unhappiness, and it is not a new one, but it started with a altogether different source. It's a real question of the trustfulness. The farmers lost. Somebody raised why it happened only in Punjab. I think the farmers' agitation during the COVID against the farm laws is directly proportional to the extent to which the MSP and procurement has penetrated. It is 100% for two crops in Punjab. They enjoy it totally. In other cases, it's not the case. Anyhow, it's nothing to do with the class of the farmer, other things. It is directly associated with the degree at which the MSP policy procurement has penetrated. So this disappointed whether it's needed or not. So let me come to my basic position. We have to separate agriculture as a sector in the economy and the farmers who take the sector forward. So in my opinion, at this point of time, agriculture as a sector is performing well. The very fact that we have the surplus of food production, 10 million ton getting rotten food grains, tomatoes have been thrown. In Bangalore, I think 8 to 10 lakh liters of the milks are wasted, So at this point of time, I don't think, except for pulses, even if you work out in per capita availability, is much above what is the National Nutrition Bureau has recommended. I think the agriculture as a sector, but what has happened to the farmers? These two are very important. Farmers' distress, farmers' migration. Nearly 1 crore hectares have been left fallow. In Karnataka, 16% of the area is uncultivated. And above all, the sorry state of farmer suicide. Be a worked agrarian distress. Karnataka is the one that has the dubious distinction of being first or second in the farmers' distress. So these two, have to be separated. Agriculture as a sector doing well at this point of time. No cause for concern for the most of the commodities at the farmers who are operating the sectors, under great distress. These two are separated. To understand this one, our conventional approach to look at the farming, productivity, cost, price, this may not work. This is a bit outdated. We have to look at the base problem in a farming community facing today is the unpredictability in various fronts. Unpredictability emanates from the two fronts. The latest one is the climate-related factors. You cannot predict the rainfall at all because of the climate change. That's fine. Farmers have been accustomed to the droughts, but the unpredictability emanating from the market-led, it has aggravated after the liberalization because we cannot predict what is going to happen right now. So unpredictability of the prices followed by unpredictability of the income earning capacity is most important for the farmers. And followed by this, insufficiency of the income. Let me come to the last one. As for our estimation, if you just look at the farmers' income purely from agriculture sources, 72% of the farmers in Karnataka are below poverty line. But still they are not under poverty because they are having the non-agriculture sources, other sources. Okay, so predictability of the price, stability of the income earning capacity followed by adequacy are the much more sort of parameter to look at the farming as a sector rather than our conventional physical approach, looking at merely sector productivity, etc., so on and so forth. So under this background, these three farm laws have been introduced, mainly centered around the price and the marketing, because the marketing is the most important one, procurement is important one. Let me get into the marketing, and also the consumer. Let me start with the consumer. Yeah, the topic is the fair to consumers as well as to the producers, no doubt. The farmers as a whole, at this point, at any point of time, I'm not ready to accept the differentiation farmer as a rich farmer, poor farmer, irrigator farmer, big farmer. Farmers are the farmer. Once you accepted the Land Ceiling Act, there should not be any rich and big farmers at all. That's the biggest social commitment farmers have undergone. There's a limit, except for farming, except for the agriculture land, there's no limit at all. So I'm not for that to look at the big Punjab farmer. That's for our own purpose. But the problem here in the farming sectors, all are under the same onslaught of the market forces. I'm very careful to use the term market forces, the middleman, procurement agencies, and other things. As well as, in case of consumers, I'm not the one, if you pardon me to come out with the new phrases. We all consumers will look at, those who are having the economic consumer, in the sense, those who are capable of, they have the money and they are capable of buying, they have the problem to buy because of the supply or price. My concern is the social consumers. That's very important, because under the backdrop of abundant production and the social consumer, the category, it may be new, I don't know what the better terminology. At this point of time in India, as per the reliable reports, within and outside, 72% of the born child are facing the acute malnutrition, anemia. 48% of the children are below 5 years are facing the malnutrition, and nearly 52% of the mothers. So malnutrition is very acute. And let us come to the question of the hunger. So, and I think as per the World Hunger Index, India stands 1 or 2 out of the 117 nations. 25% of the world hunger are very much in India. 1 out of 7 in India, as per the hunger estimations, are going hungry. So what is this strange, cruel triangularity? On one hand, you will have the abundance production. On the other hand, you will have malnutrition, hunger. On the other hand, farmers having the acute distress, migration. So this triangularity is much more relevant at this point of time. Why, in spite of producing so much, people are hungry and suffers the malnutrition? Why, in spite of producing, giving abundance, I don't hesitate to salute the farmers of this nation. It were to be Sri Lanka, had the acute shortage, there's a distress. This triangularity should be attempted not merely from the academic perspective, larger political and social perspective. And this background, whether they attempt to bring about change for the APMC or market structure is right or wrong should be visualized. What is APMC? It has got the 2 dimensions. It is a government control, no doubt. Second, it is agriculture produce marketing committees, it is democratic bodies. So democracy is not working anywhere, at least in major cases in India, no doubt. The APMCs are corrupt, inefficient, all this will agree. But whether we need the reforms, just because of democracy won't work, we should abandon the democracy in the parliament and assemblies. Why only in APMCs? And inefficiency lies anywhere. So instead of looking at, to undertake the reforms, I think the wholesale abandoning, in my opinion, right now, we have not bring back the earlier status. Ordinance very much lies in Karnataka for the APMCs. Karnataka APMC is virtually redundant. Class 8 of the APMC Act has been amended because in APMC is totally made defunct. So we have to re-look at whether the APMCs are needed in a different forum or the reform so much, So in this background, MSP assumes crucial, important attention. MSP is repealed for 23 crops. Hardly the success in ensuring the MSP in a state like Karnataka, so-called progressive state, hardly 12 to 20% of the commodity that are brought into the APMCs, MSP is declared. MSP is ensured. Hardly 12 to 20%. Say, paddy is brought to here, but not everything is brought to, under the purview of marketing, under the purview of APMCs. So guaranteeing MSP and ensuring a predictable income through, I think the rightly mentioned, through some sort of the recent basis, the aggregations. We have attempted cooperative digital marketing system in Karnataka. I think such a things, in aggregation, farmers collectively strong, individually weak. That's the theme with which our Agriculture Price Commission has proceeded. So with this background, let me stop with, at this point of time, our attention should be farming as a whole. There's no question of dividing the farmers, rich or poor, Punjab. The farmers as a whole needs attention. Within the consumer, the social category is much more important. Poor without food, malnutrition is much more important. So what we needed is not merely market, taking the market into the market aspects, like the value addition, but what is required is the distribution. Distribution has got a tremendous social impact, social justice. So distribution to the poor, distribution also should be part of the market. We just miss the term distribution because maybe our aversion to the ideological background with which distribution has put forth. Let me stop at this point of time. We need the market. We need the government intervention. We need the present structure in which, we have the control, and our dimension, our focus should be on the social segment of the consumer, rather only to those who are capable, could not by inflation, other reason.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Kamadi. You've made a number of issues from climate change, predictability, need for predictability of income, malnutrition, and the social aspects of consumption. Perhaps we'll come back to this in the second round of interventions. I now like to ask Sudha if she could make her brief presentation. Yeah.
So I meant to set the background that even preceded Dr. Kamadi's intervention, but I'm happy that he has covered ground on my behalf. But I do want to take a couple of points that he mentioned, especially his concern about not differentiating across farmers as well as stability. I'll just try and share my views on that. But before that, I just want to talk about three major points. One is, what is the position of farming in farmers' lives? The second is, what is the farmer's position in what has come to become a very complex set of value chains, different for different commodities and so on. And the third element is this diversity, whether it's heterogeneity of farmers, crops and commodities, the market structure, whether it's domestic facing or whether a global commodity, and so on. So in some sense, it doesn't make sense to speak of one Indian agriculture, but the idea that we may have to think of plural models and a plurality of solutions to address different issues. So I'll start with agriculture's position in farmers' livelihoods. Today, we know that this is something that's fairly commonly known now, very small holdings. We know that the Ag Census says it's just over a hectare, but operated area, as per the most recent 2019 survey, says it's less than a hectare. And that's not going to change very soon, partly because of various legal systems that are somewhat pro-small farmer and pro-small holding, and also because of the nature of structural transformation in India, that migration out of agriculture typically happened because there were routine jobs available in the non-farm sector. That's not happening, and therefore we should expect to see these very strong ties to agriculture remain. But we do know that because of these small holdings, farmers, agriculture households depend on plural activities and sources of income, almost 40% coming from just wages. But interestingly, out of the crop from farming, 37% is coming from crop. But you have this huge elephant in the room that is often ignored, which is livestock, poultry, fish, which is 15.5% according to the latest survey. So you see this when you talk about agriculture marketing, the diversity is right there. Now, which are the levers? I think Professor Kamadi rightly said we should focus on incomes, not just prices or productivity. And here's this very complex set of levers that we can influence or address to get farmers' incomes to a place where it's remunerative. In fact, one interesting study that we did was to ask farmers when they thought they could be good farmers. We asked, who's a good farmer? And they essentially said, when I'm able to live off just my farming activities. So that's something to keep in mind. So with that, I move to what is the farmer's position within agriculture? We all know agriculture is contributing just 14% of their GDP, but my colleagues in IFPRI actually compute that almost 30% of the GDP, India's GDP, is actually agri plus those that are related to agriculture. In some sense, again, nationally, agriculture is very tied to the rest of the economy, which is also where the new jobs are to be found. So a farmer who's moving away from farming will likely find jobs in sectors related to farming. There is also this empirical regularity that we are seeing in the data globally, that as structural transformation happen and the nature of the economy changes, where agriculture becomes a smaller part of the sectoral distribution of where the income is being generated, we also see that the farmers share in the consumer rupee spent. So this is like decomposing the dollar that the consumer spends on food at home. When you actually look at what proportion is going to the farmer, globally it's 27%. In India, it's been much higher, but it's coming down rapidly, which implies that a lot of the value created is actually happening away from the farm, post-farm, so post-harvest. This then suggests that farmers are now no longer food producers. They are more accurately described as producers of raw materials for the food industry. So most of what we eat today is in some form of processed packaged, graded. And I think that's something to bear in mind. And I'm sure Mr. Nandakumar will have something to say about this idea of value creation and value addition, and how farmers should move towards getting a higher share of what happens post-farm. The other big shift in the ground is that over years since independence, we've gradually moved from a food system that was farm to fork, where most consumers ate what was produced, to something that's become a plate to plow model, where consumer demands actually exert an unprecedented influence on what farmers should be growing or growing lucratively. So this is the farmer's position in agriculture, which just goes to say that we have to think about farming very, very differently from the way we have. And certainly, it's not really narrowly defined. There's product diversification, reaching the consumers according to the consumer's needs, but doing it in the most effective way possible. So I would go back and actually here maybe I differ a little bit with Dr. Kamardi's view that at the end of the day, your farmers' incomes come from the prices. The market is in fact what is monetizes all their work that they put over the seasons in terms of growing the crop and doing any post-harvest operations that they undertake. They also incur large costs in transportation, in inputs, which are mostly purchased. In fact, a colleague of mine who has done research, Meghla Krishnamurthy, often says that farmers are those who buy everything at retail price but have to sell it at wholesale price. So in some sense, cost is also a very important concern. But the quantity they sell and of the quality that the consumer desires, all of these together make up the incomes. And there I would just want to say that the role of the market goes beyond just establishing prices, because the marketplace, which ideally should be where the consumer meets the producers, if not directly, indirectly, it becomes the source of information. The prices also signal what is desired. I mean, if you look at the range of quality of just chilies in Bayadge in Karnataka, you will see about 7 or 8 varieties, each of them priced differently. So clearly, this quality is also something that the price conveys to farmers. The costs, of course, and I'll come back to this in just a minute. And this idea of smallholders being too small relative to the cost they have to incur. So the aggregation models that Mr. Kamardi spoke of comes there. I just want to define a goalpost that we need to use as a way of when we discuss marketing and marketing reform. One is, as Mr. Kamardi said, volatility is a very important issue. Most farmers don't have the capacity to absorb price shocks. Remunerative prices, in the sense of getting a price that's more than adequately covers the cost that they incur, is important, but also in some sense fair prices. How much of the consumer's dollar or rupee can actually goes back to the farmer? And these markets where farmers actually transact should have ideally two attributes. One is that it must be proximate in the sense of being accessible at a very low cost, but it should also be contestable so that they're not dependent on just one buyer, which then puts them at a poorer bargaining position in order to get better prices and fairer prices. Now, there have been a lot of the government policy interventions from the time of independence can be organized as things that address one or two of these problems. And I want to skip all of that because I'm sure we'll come back to the discussion on APMCs, but focus on two recent issues. So I think of these problems of markets as both involving or needing some technological innovations, but combined with institutional innovations. And these solutions are all available. Many of them have been tried and tested. And I think Karnataka is quite exemplar in the efforts. If you go to Shimoga and see the Arakanut cooperatives or Hopcoms or the APMC reform itself, which was a great lesson in how to do marketing reform, many of them have fallen by the wayside, but it's not as if we need new ideas. Sometimes it's useful to think outside the box. Sometimes it's very useful to think inside the box. And I would advocate looking a little within ourselves and from other states and where states learn from each other. And so we've had the APMC model, the procurement system, dairy cooperatives, and cooperatives that work a little differently, like the Arakanut, and all of these provide solutions. And in horizon, we have these large ag tech players coming up and intervening in or proposing solutions in both information, price discovery, ag advisories, cost reductions, and we have this whole range of solutions that we need to explore.
Thank you, Sudha. I think what struck me was, the change that you painted of what has happened and what is going on in agriculture and in agricultural marketing has changed substantially from what conventional understanding tells us. I now asked Mr. Nandakumar to make his presentation. I wonder if now or in the next round, Mr. Nandakumar, both Dr. Kamardi and Sudha have spoken a lot about farming changes that have taken place in pricing and marketing. Since we are talking about both prices for farmers and for consumers, I wonder if you could also bring in, that aspect about consumers, what consumers should accept, look forward to, and, what we should be thinking about. So over to you. Yeah.
Before getting into that, just a bit of a background so that people understand what we are talking about. Well, markets have existed within APMCs, outside APMCs for a long time. They'll continue to exist. They'll continue to perform with whatever asymmetries they are capable of. And Sudha did speak about, the market asymmetries on information. I think the traders have used market information and the information asymmetry to their advantage. And that is where the real set of problems started. And we are very fond of using the word middlemen. I would like to call them intermediaries. They do perform a function. You like them or you don't like them, that's a different issue, but they do perform a function. But the problem in the value chain is there are far too many intermediaries and they all add to the cost of the transaction. Now, can we do disintermediation? Probably not really. Can we reduce the cost of intermediation is probably something that we can do. But we often forget that most of these intermediaries access funds at a very high cost, including from the farmers to the last retailer. And the cost of finance actually adds a lot more to the cost of intermediation. Of course, there are other issues along with that. So what do we do? Wherever intermediation has been, cost effective or less costly, there have been very strong institutions. And I'll come back to that institutions when I talk about dairy. Now, our policy, unfortunately, you said consumers have been really consumer-centric. And I say this with a certain amount of responsibility because I would point out the two acts, the Essential Commodities Act of 1955, which is primarily for price control. And interestingly, that was the third constitutional amendment which enabled the passing of this act because they amended entry 33 in the concurrent list. The other is the Foreign Trade and Development and Regulation of 1992, the first act after the 1991 reforms, which still allows the DGFT to ban exports or restrict exports. And of course, the favorite examples of how many times do onion exports get banned in India or cotton exports for that matter. Now, interestingly, when I mentioned cotton, the first APMC regulation was 1887 for raw cotton, done by the British government then. And the interesting part is that it was supposed to ensure availability of cotton to the Manchester textile mills at reasonable prices. And this is an interesting history to the APMC. And I think we have generally continued along that line, even though in 1960s and 70s, we created most of these APMCs with 3 or 4 major objectives. One was price discovery. The other was prompt payment. The third was a link to markets, which actually happened only a linkage to the wholesale markets, not so much to retail markets, and to provide infrastructure. They did well in the beginning, but of course it went into a lot of disuse later, and largely because the hold of the farmers on APMCs waned. And they were either taken over by traders and intermediaries or the strong arm of the government, which found extra budgetary resources from APMCs. And for the information of those who are listening, the APMC fees is never deposited in the treasury. It's not part of the state budget. So it's free money to spend for development. So that became a vested interest over a period of time. And therefore, a lot of people wanted to reform the APMCs, starting with Shankar Lal Guru in 2000 until the 15th Finance Commission, which is 2020. There are lots of suggestions on that. I don't want to get into that APMC because I have a monograph on the farm laws, which is freely downloadable from the Food and Land Use Coalition website. Then came ENAM, which is our answer to a unified national market. It had its own problems. I would think that it failed on two counts, or it did not succeed adequately on two counts. One was that there was not enough aggregation at the back end from farmers. And I think there was an overemphasis on digitization. And that probably did it in for quite good reasons. Well, on MSP and procurement, I think we should start by understanding that MSP and procurement is an offshoot of two things, which is the Green Revolution and our food security concerns. These two, and interestingly, the MSP is only for 23 crops, which is 7 cereals, 5 pulses, 7 oil seeds, and 4 commercial crops, which are fibers, and sugarcane. And sugarcane alone has a statutory minimum support price because it is linked to the sugar mills, and sugar mills are mandated to pay a statutory minimum price. So it's different from an MSP regime. So all those who are arguing for a mandatory MSP might as well look at that. But this 23 crops constitute about 28% of the gross value added in agriculture. So what happens to the other farmers who bring up the rest of the agriculture GVA, of which 24% would come from milk, 21% fruits and vegetables, which has probably been recording the largest CAGR over the last 2 decades, and largely responding to consumer demands. And fruit and vegetable farmers have no minimum support price, not much of support from APMCs either, except a few APMCs here and there, maybe the onion ones in Nashik or 1 or 2 potato kind of places. And of course, 8% from the eggs group. So that brings me back to 2 success stories which are outside the MSP regime. One is milk, and having been chairman of NDDB, I can speak about that with a little bit of confidence. But before I go there, we must also understand that the large food subsidy that we are talking about, 200,000 crores, the latest calculation from Arvind Subramaniam and Devesh Kapoor show that less than 20% actually go to the farmers. About 15 to 16% goes to state governments in various costs and taxes, and the balance is actually a consumer subsidy. So that partly answers the consumer bias that we have in the system. Now, in terms of milk, of course, everybody knows the story, but the fact remains that it went up from 17 million tons in 50-51 to 210 million tons in the last year. And the per capita went up from 130 to 427 grams per day. Now, the more important part of what NDDB did or Amul did is that not less than 75% of the consumer rupee goes back to the farmer. And that is where the success is. The other success story is poultry, which is again driven by a private enterprise through the National Egg Coordination Committee. And of course, the famous statement, my egg, my price, my life. A very interesting contrast to NDDB, which again has done wonders in that sector. So the egg farmers also get a reasonable price, except of course those who are in backyard poultry. Now, basically, what do we do therefore? I think one of the things we need to do probably is to look at institutions. Institutions, we're talking about cooperatives. Now they're saying the primary agriculture credit societies can do other things. The FPOs, the farmer producer organizations, if 10,000 of them come up in addition to the 7,000 or 8,000 we have already, are they going to make a change? Probably yes. So therefore, getting the markets right for the consumer would mean aggregation with control by farmers. And I would also argue that all APMCs be made completely farmer-owned organizations. The current management setup is not something that is very farmer-friendly. Therefore, I think there is a need for a change. The second part of it is I would see about 3 or 4 challenges which we need to consider when we are looking at the markets. One is the technology disruptor. A lot of food tech, fintech, ag tech companies are coming up. Will they add value to the farmer? Probably yes, that is where they should survive. But most of them, unfortunately, are coming at the consumer end, which is the food tech. And all business models show that the company which is closer to the consumer gets a maximum share of the profit. And that is something that we need to worry about. The nutrition challenge, which is a major challenge, not so much hunger, but more undernutrition. So should we be producing more of nutritious cereals, nutritious pulses? And of course, there is a protein issue. How do we then create value for the farmers? Because most of them are in rain-fed conditions with low productivity and much lower marketing skills. And of course, the consumer challenge, which is a market challenge, what would they prefer? Organic, natural, where are we on that? And of course, the farmer income issue. If there isn't enough income for the farmer, why should they be in farming at all? The last, which I think is a serious one, is the climate challenge. Because will we be able to continue what we are doing on the production side? So I would think it's a very complex issue, and market is an important factor in the entire complex issue of agriculture of the next decade. And here, I would think that institutions for connecting the farmers to the market with the way NDDB does, or the National Egg Coordination Committee does, or any of the other institutions do, is important. The policy environment where we get adequate infrastructure invested in the market end, which is from the back end to the retail, because a lot of it, and when we talk about meat, milk, fish, the delivery end at the consumer needs to be the part of a cold chain. So how are we going to do that? So these are going to be major issues, and I would leave it at that.
Thank you, Mr. Nandakumar. You also covered a very large area, and there's one thing about institutions that important. I would like each of you to, one particular aspect which each of you have mentioned, but in different respects. You know, traditionally we thought of farming as only growing crops. Now, all of you have talked about fruits, vegetables, milk, especially Mr. Nandakumar. Sudha has also spoken about it earlier, that in terms of value, that these now exceed the value of crops that are grown. I mean, that could be because the prices of crops are suppressed, but that's a different matter. But we know that fruits, vegetables, milk, you know, they account for the larger value of produced by agriculture and animal husbandry. And that is also an area where consumers are interested. I mean, they have greater preference now for eating the fruits and vegetables and milk products, but they're also concerned about prices, because the prices of those, my hunch, I'm just out of my head, have probably grown faster than those of cereals. Now, I wonder, Sudha, if we can start with you, and then Dr. Kamadi, to talk a bit, very briefly, about fruits, vegetables, and milk, you know, about both farmer prices, producer prices, and consumer prices. I mean, we have institutions, especially with respect to dairy, which Mr. Nandakumar spoke about. But what do we look at for ensuring a fair price for both farmers and consumers as well?
One view that many of us hold is that it's hard to get both right. If you keep prices for the consumers low, where is that technologically optimistic simplistic view is to say that we are going to get efficiency gains in the value chain. Now, the question is who's making those efficiency gains and passing it on to the consumers. In our experience, these efficiency gains are captured by those who are not in the farming sector. And that's one of the reasons when we think of value chains in horticulture crops and other high value commodities that especially are perishable and therefore need larger investments in cold storages if it's not locally marketed. The question of what kind of institutions can we create such that farmers have get a share of those, say, efficiency gains or investments that they are making. Now, there I think we run into a second problem, which is that of aggregation. There are, in my view, there are products that are aggregable and there are products that are not. And by that I mean those that have a high variation in quality and also a different market for each. Now, if you look at the consumer spectrum in India, you have those who are willing to pay a premium for apples that are exactly the same size. And there are others who might be able to afford, who don't mind apples that are all damaged or smaller and don't shine. It means that the consumer market is segmented. And it goes back to Mr. Kamadi's point that consumers are also of different social classes and we should care about the poorer ones. And so in these kind of contexts, it becomes very hard to have aggregation models because in a same area of FPO may have different members, not all of whom can control the quality beyond a point, which is inimical to collectivization. So we find a lot of areas where farmers refuse to pool their produce for sale because somebody else has inferior quality produce and I have better quality produce. But on average, I lose out because I'm the one who's bringing better produce and others are not. So these become difficulties with institutional innovations, and there we have to rely on getting models where farmers are able to access institutions or markets where the distance between the consumer and the producer is lower, as well as harvesting the premium that consumers are willing to pay for investments they would make. So there's always, my view is that there's always going to be market segmentation based on which consumer you're catering to. Farmers should, who make investments in reaching the premium consumers, must, I won't say extract, but take advantage of the willingness to pay for non-price attributes. And the other one would then function as the markets that are in village hearts or local towns and itinerant vendors for a very large class of players in the supply chain. So we are going to see very diverse ways in which value chains get built in the high value segment. And that's also why I think that we need to think of plural channels or where farmers meet consumers or engage with consumers.
Dr. Kamadi, can I request you to cover this aspect about prices of fruits and vegetables, especially, which is the new growth area, what your experience has been in Karnataka, having been studying these markets and traveling the breadth of the state?
Three things, I think the modest attempts should not attract the attention which actually deserves. Hope, the learned panelist would take note of that one. Number one, we are the first one to, as I said the other day, to come out of the prediction model, price forecasting model, try to extend it to the supply projection and, if possible, demand projections. There are models, but they are not the dynamic model. They don't take the time into account. So, taking the help of the information technology giants, Microsoft and IBM, we could try to predict the price behavior of fruits and vegetables, and mostly vegetables. Tomato, onion, potato are keep on giving headache to the government, especially tomato and the onion. So it becomes extremely difficult to capture through the model because of the obvious reasons are there. We cannot say. One among them is their regional specificity, location specificity, and the technology front is also enormous. There are the varieties which can give huge return, but they are not matched with the time and space dimension. We produce tomato only in one district called the Kolar, near to the Bangalore. We don't know what to do. Though it can be possible to produce other, we produce in a particular season, In my opinion, there is no surplus strictly if you take up the distribution across time and space. Let me repeat, distribution tomato price is flashed in production center in the same time we could see that it's not reaching to the consumers. So it's merely take care of the space dimension, theoretically time, space and farm utilities, which could help the farmers. We always focus on the farm utility in the sense, processing, value addition, creation of value chain, forgetting two basic aspects of the utilities in helping the farmer through the time and space. What is the time utility? Sudhaji has mentioned, provide adequate storage, cold storage facilities. To see that from the post-harvest depression to a season in which consumer demand is very high, take that produce to that level, either through processing or whatever it may be, and coupled with storage, and also from place of abundance to the place of scarcity. So this is very important. This could enhance. My one simple, candid recommendation, wherever there is a surplus production, let the government intervene. We could succeed to some extent, not in a. Let the government intervention provide the transportation logistic at free of cost. Call the people at some places like the coastal area where the tomatoes are huge demand. Call them, so transport from this place to Malur is a Kolar district, abundant production place. Kolar is the biggest tomato market in South India, probably enter India. To provide the logistic facility at free of cost or subsidize, a simple, small recommendation will create, and also cold storage, we had to come out with a storage. We look at only raw production, distribution. So this is a big problem. This didn't attract them in our attempt to project, come out with something, the modern technologies, rich and models, should come to our rescue to see that, what is the price. Two things, we are the first one to come out with an elaborate policy recommendation for group approach to the agriculture marketing. It may be cooperatives, Sudhaji rightly mentioned, Areca, it's from my area. There is a historical reason why Areca could succeed. Milk, you know very well. Like that, Hopcom is a partial success. Look at all these FEOs. Several, it is not merely cooperative, it's a group approach to the agriculture marketing, making use of Indian Institute of Plantation Management. It's the official report. It is very much available in our website, So that we could not take it forward because some problem, later on the government has changed. So group approach agriculture marketing, looking at the time and space dimension and final lot person. It may be a bit controversial. So we are the first one to come out with guaranteeing the prices to begin with MSP through legal recourses, not only one, along with followed by some other steps. We could work very closely with the National Law School of India. Our official report as a recommendation very much is there. We are the first one to come out. If the MSP is declared by the government of India, if it's not enforced by the state government, that is a breach of one government is not taking the recommendation further. So somehow in the legal approach, we could come out with. Legal approach should be followed by all these things, time, space, farm utilities, a rigorous procurement program, not merely procurement, the ensuring prices, different ways are there. The Prime Minister Asha has come out with a basket of measures to ensure the prices for farmers. One among them is the price deficiency payment, procurement, encouraging the private procurer with the incentives like that, with all these things, the legal approach or the statutory provision to see that no crop in Karnataka is sold or bought below the MSP or below the statutory price. We don't have the MSP for horticulture crops. We came out with at least cost of production, A1 plus, at least A1 plus for family labor cost should be procured. So these three put together would address, one is looking at the basics of, when a cricket batsman fails in every aspect, and he has, look at your basics, whether your footwork is cut, look at the time dimension, space dimension of the agriculture marketing. Then a group approach followed by some sort of statutory approach. You are the MRP, maximum retail price. Even for a cold drink, even during the hot season is the same price. Why cannot the same logic apply? Let them charge higher price during the hot season. Let the cold drinks be sold at a higher price in the desert. It's not the case. For the consumer protection, MSP should be to protect the farmers, to see that below which a benchmark price. And our candid recommendation, MSP should be extended at least for tomato, potato, onion, and some other horticulture crops. And milk is indirectly is there, in the MSP is there, because when we work out, the KMF is there. That's what, we could see that we could reach to the, at least to the farmer, the stabilizing the farmer, production at the farm level also would ultimately benefit the consumers. Let us not look at the price alone is something which is disturbing the consumers. The supply, uneven supply, erratic supply, all these things are very equally important, that we have to look at that dimension also.
Thank you, Dr. Kamadi. Nandakumar, you were the one who spoke at some length about prices of horticulture, fruits and vegetables and milk. Could you expand on that aspect again? I mean, we have spoken a lot about farmers' concerns. I'm not saying that we should speak about consumers' concerns. How do you find the right balance? I mean, how do you set up institutions so that farmers get a right price as well as the consumers pay a decent price, which is not a burden, but at the same time is not subsidized or
Let
controlled?
me look at it from business perspective. Let's split price into different components. There is a cost of production, which is what farmer is concerned with. Then there are various costs before it reaches the consumer. So what we have to really attack is the various costs in between the consumer and the farmer, which if you look at fruits and vegetables could be as high as 60 to 65%. This is where I think the real problem of not having adequate institutions, not having the logistics to support what happens in the value chain has become the problem. Of course, whether the Agri Infrastructure Fund, which now talks about creating huge infrastructure, will help in some way, yes. One of the basic issues we had was shortage of power. If you wanted to do all this 20 years ago, I don't think it was possible. UP couldn't do milk because it didn't have adequate power to do its, cold chain right from the procurement to the retail. Now that we have power in most parts of India on a dependable basis, we can look at cold chains. Of course, it will add to the cost, but somewhere I think the wastage would compensate for part of it. The other part is how do we look at the cost of production? I think there are costs which can be reduced, and it's largely due to one of it could be a technological obsolescence, which we are struggling with at this point. The second, as Sudha said, is differentiation of products. I remember good old days, the coffee board had a pooling system. Good coffee, bad coffee, indifferent coffee, everything used to get pooled and it used to be auctioned. So the good coffee producers who thought they should get premium prices wanted to opt out, but the law didn't permit. But it was amended, I think, somewhere in the 90s. And, now you have different types of coffee fetching different prices. So that's one. So should organic be the same as something that uses a lot of fertilizer and pesticides? Probably not. So this is where a bit of product differentiation. So as Sudha mentioned, from raw material suppliers to product sellers is a kind of shift that we have to create, and we have to create that product differentiation. And in the Indian market, let's also accept the fact that fresh and frozen is still the largest segment. It's not so much processed. Yes, there is a growing processed food segment happening, and they are capturing most of the value. That's a different issue to be tackled. But the fresh and frozen segment, which still commands a large volume, hasn't delivered value to the farmers. So, like for instance, in the dairy sector itself, what's the average per liter, per cow milk in most parts of the country? We have to invest in genomics, we have to invest in nutrition, and we have to invest in better hygiene. Three clear directions in which the dairy sector has to look at competitiveness in value, cost of production. We haven't done enough. The nutrition that we give to our cows is still very unscientific. The genomics part is still not even talked about. And of course, in the fruit and vegetable segment, how much do we lose between the farm and the consumer? So these are issues which require government intervention and very effective institutions. And I would disagree with Mr. Kamadi that, government is not the best marketeer of anything. I think we have to leave it to the farmers' own innovativeness and their linkage with whatever, market channels open up, private, public, consumer, whichever way they look at it, that's the best way. And in fact, again, the story of Amul, which can take on multinational giants, is largely because they have invested in consumer relationships, they have invested in technology, and they look at consumers as their real annadatas in many ways. That's very, very important. Pricing, of course, is something that's dynamic. Yes, there are poor people who need some kind of support. I think that has to come through a larger program, which is either universal basic income model or some other support system. Because I personally believe that in the name of the consumer, the farmer should not be asked to pay the price. I think it's a taxpayer's burden or it's a government's burden.
First, thank the speakers for giving very effective interventions on a very complex subject, which has many dimensions, many issues.
Thank you for staying on for the full conversation. If you like what we do, please share it with your friends and family. You can also leave us a review or rating on iTunes and Apple Podcasts. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is Gaurav Krishna on sound supervision and production, with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Raghavendra Tenkaila. Artwork and design is by Chandni Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. Do follow us on Instagram for updates on all our programming. This is Lekha Naidu signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.